let's talk about all the films I watched in January. Straight up, I didn't hate Maestro as much as everyone else seemed to. I think it has some things that really worked and some things that really didn't. The standout for me here is definitely the performances, specifically from Bradley Cooper and Carey Mulligan. They both were just so charismatic and captivating to watch. Their chemistry together was completely off the charts, and it's been a while since I've seen chemistry pop this much. On the other hand, this film had some pretty bad performances coming from Sarah Silverman and Maya Hawke, who thankfully aren't in the film for very long. One critique I've seen a lot of is that we don't learn anything about Leonard Bernstein, and I just really disagree with that. This biopic doesn't go the typical route where they go line by line through their life events and accomplishments. Instead, it focuses more on intimate, self-analyzing moments and relationships between Bernstein and his art, or his relationships with family. I can't help but make a comparison to something like Baz Luhrmann's Elvis, which took a very surface-level approach of showing the career of Elvis, but I didn't feel like I got to know what made Elvis tick. And that's one of the reasons why I didn't like that movie at all. It didn't feel personal at all. Maestro, I think, takes the complete opposite approach, where you learn what makes Bernstein tick, but you're left a little confused about his career and the exact details about his personal life and sexuality, at least for someone like me who doesn't know much about him. I loved these introspective moments where we get to learn about Bernstein, but admittedly, I think those moments are hidden behind mega pretentious dialogue that's hard to unpack. There's so much dialogue that feels like it doesn't mean anything that it was easy for me to zone out, and I had to consciously force myself to pay attention in moments where it sounded like they were finally talking about something important. And I will admit that for how long the film is, we don't get as much information out of it as we should. The plot or story is very, very thin. A lot of the time is wasted on conversations that seem to contribute little to the plot or characters, or on artsy montages. I think also visually it looks beautiful, and I loved hearing Bernstein's music throughout the film. Past Lives was just okay for me, and I'm so mad at myself for not loving this as much as everyone else does, and as much as I wanted to. I think ultimately this is just super slow. It felt very long and very slow, but there is at least a tiny thread of a story and journey. I just prefer more plot, more content, more romance. I do really love the concept of Inyon and how your connections in your past lives influence the relationships that you have in this life, and just this eternal mystery of how exactly you may have been connected before, and what this means for your current life and your future lives, and the mystery or uncertainty about whether you followed the path that you were destined to based on your history together over thousands of past lives. And I think this concept is beautifully articulated in the visuals as well as the story and dialogue. It captures the awkwardness of reuniting with old friends in such an authentic way, and I liked Greta Lee's performance. It's a subtle role, I think, but a good performance. There are movies that I hate with a burning passion, and I can't for the life of me figure out why they're popular or critically acclaimed, but this one I can at least understand why most people really love it. Then I watched Saw X. I am a Saw fan. I enjoy watching all the movies, even though I don't think they've been good really since Saw 2. Saw X doesn't live up to the best films in the franchise, but it's definitely the best one we've seen in a while. What interests me the most about this entry in the franchise is that this is the first time that we're seeing all these traps from Jigsaw's point of view. The traps feel more justified than they usually do, and therefore are a little more cathartic and enjoyable to watch. I liked the story a lot in this one. The traps were pretty standard for the series, the visual look was pretty standard. It's a good addition to the series, keeping the same lore and vibe, but improving upon it in some ways. Speaking of films that improved upon their franchise, let's now move on to Beneath the Planet of the Apes, which absolutely did not do that thing that I was just saying. This is the 1970s sequel to the original Planet of the Apes film. This film was pretty rough for me. First off, I think it's pretty hard to follow the first movie. The first movie was a tad too slow for me, but I still thought it was really well done with the social commentary and the world building and prosthetics. The sequel was just so utterly boring. A lot of it felt so low effort, just copying the first movie whenever it could. It didn't capture the mystery and wisdom of the first one whatsoever. I really got a kick out of some of the new people they meet in this film. I don't remember what they were called, and when looking it up, I guess they're just called the telepathic humans. They play a pretty significant part in this film, and they don't even have a name. But they were pretty entertaining to watch. The ending of this film is wild, too. That is one thing I can say about this film, is I haven't seen an ending like that ever. Annabelle is one of those movies that I've had no interest in watching, but I felt like I had to watch it for the culture. It's pretty bland overall, it doesn't really tread any new territory. It's pretty much just a copy of Child's Play, but it plays it completely serious and doesn't have any interesting characters. I'm talking about Chucky. I didn't really care much about the characters, but I did like the storyline of one of the side characters. That is one positive thing I can say. It's also not scary in the slightest, but that was kind of the appeal to me on that day when I decided to watch it. It's something easy, not too stressful to put on. The characters kept doing dumb shit too, which is a fine line to tread with a horror movie. They need to make some dumb decisions so that they get themselves into trouble occasionally, but it can't be so often that we're constantly screaming at the screen. The production design felt pretty cheap, like, this does not scream 1970s to me at all, which makes sense since this was a relatively low-budget movie. It's just a basic horror movie. It doesn't necessarily need to be technically good in all aspects to justify its existence, but there should at least be something there that makes the story compelling, and it just wasn't for me. Navalny has to be one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. The whole time I was just shocked, bamboozled, on the edge of my seat. It was an intense ride from start to finish. It tells the story of Putin's rival, Alexei Navalny, and his mysterious poisoning. I'm not really saying anything new here. This film is critically acclaimed. It won the Oscar for Best Documentary in 2023. The story itself is just really interesting. Twists and turns, and that one scene that everyone talks about. Like, I was sitting there watching with my mouth hanging open for 10 minutes, literally. I also loved getting this insight into Navalny as a normal person. We see him with his family, and we see the inner workings of his political operations. Watching him film TikToks poking fun at what happened to him, seeing him get excited over how many likes or views his videos would get. I just feel like we don't ever get to see that side of politicians. The message is super powerful and haunting. I was unsettled. I still am. I could not stop thinking about this movie for days after I watched it. Hi, this is future me popping in for a few minutes. I recorded this audio in early February, which, by the way, I'm really sorry that this video is taking so long to be posted. But anyway, things have obviously changed a little bit since I recorded the audio for this. I don't really want to say too much because I don't want to spoil the story for people who don't know very much about it, and I know it's current news, so it's not necessarily a spoiler in the same way that a movie spoiler would be. This is a documentary after all, but yeah, I just don't want to say too much, but I think the recent news kind of just emphasizes everything that I said and thought about the documentary and just really emphasizes how important it is and how devastating and haunting it is. So obviously, just if you don't know anything about the story, if you haven't seen the documentary already, I, again, just really encourage you all to watch it. Then I watched That Darn Cat. I love Disney live-action movies from the 60s, preferably with Hayley Mills in them, and I can't watch the original Parent Trap all the time. I feel like I watched that one way too much. I feel like this movie hits the spot if you're ever in the mood for a 60s comedy, like I am sometimes, but other than that, it's not really anything special. It did have some pretty funny moments, 60s slapstick of course, but it did make me laugh a few times. I don't know how I've gone so long without ever seeing Uptown Girls. At least in my mind, it's held up as this modern rom-com classic, and it definitely measured up to its reputation. There's something that just sets some rom-coms apart, something that makes them feel completely magical, and this was one of them. This movie came out in 2003, and it was a little scary to see how dated it already looks. Just another reminder of how old we're getting. First off, I have to say the performances were incredible. Brittany Murphy was just electric and her charisma was off the charts. People always say that about her, and this was the movie where I really saw her shine. Dakota Fanning was also so good in both the serious and funny moments. Obviously, the main relationship here is between Brittany and Dakota's characters, which I want to say that I love how their romance plays a relatively minor part in the story. I love that this movie mostly focuses on this sisterly relationship between two girls, and I just loved their storyline and progression. Loved the ending, it was so moving and adorable, and All the pieces just fit together so perfectly. Really good 2000 soundtrack too, by the way. Then I watched the 2023 Disney live-action remake, Peter Pan and Wendy, which I really liked, but I am predisposed to like anything in the Peter Pan universe. I just love the world of Neverland and I love the story. It's kind of hard for them to mess up the formula so bad that I end up not liking it. The cast was all fine, but the two that I specifically wanted to note were Jude Law and Jim Gaffigan. Loved Jim Gaffigan as Smee. Kind of a different visual take on the character, but it still worked, and the comedic delivery was great, of course. I have to say that I didn't love Jude Law as Hook. I just didn't quite buy into him being a villain. And I have to say, weird choice not to go with tradition and have Hook and the father be played by the same actor. Jude Law would have killed the role of the father. I did love the additions they made to Hook's character and story, though. Overall, they made some interesting choices, some that I liked and some that I didn't like. All of Tinkerbell's storylines were basically erased, so there was no point to her being there at all, but yet they would still try to involve her in the story even though she had nothing to say. The visual effects on Tinkerbell were awful as well. Uncanny Valley vibes. I did love what they did with Tiger Lily's character, though. The message is beautiful, and maybe that's always been the message of this story, but I think this is the first time where it really clicked for me, and it hit me hard. The visuals were pretty bland, specifically scenes on the pirate ship. It was just so overwhelmingly sepia, and we don't really get a great look at Neverland, which sucks. I liked that they had homages to the original Disney movie with the title card, for example, and some of the old music. But again, the story is just so good, and I just can't help but get attached to the characters by the end. Then I watched Sydney White, which is a 2007 retelling of Snow White. This was so bland. It wasn't funny at all, which is such a waste of Amanda Bynes' talents. I didn't really care about any of the actors, the characters, except for Sarah Paxton. I'm an Aquamarine girly, so I loved seeing her. This just doesn't have anything that sets it apart at all. It just feels like such a lazy rom-com. I will say, though, that I didn't hate my life while watching it. It was at least decently entertaining just following the story along. This one is just so unmemorable. I know I'm never going to watch this again. In a few years, I'll probably forget that I ever watched it. I watched The Prince and Me, which is another really popular rom-com that I've never seen before, and I hated it. The love interest was just so insufferable. I honestly think I've never seen a worse love interest in a movie ever before in my life. Based on the name, I'm sure you can tell it's a secret prince trope, and it also follows the enemies to lovers formula, which I'm fine with, but the prince was just the skeeviest, most immature guy I've ever seen, and you can't have a rom-com where the guy is that unappealing.
Paige.
So, will you take your top off for me?
What?
Take your top off for me, like wild college girls.
I just never got over that. The structure of the movie was also a little weird to me. It felt like two movies in one. There was no romance, there was no comedy, there was nothing redeeming about this movie other than Julia Stiles, and you would be better off just watching 10 Things I Hate About You instead. Then I watched the highly anticipated, critically acclaimed Zone of Interest, and I was so disappointed. Definitely part of the problem is the mega hype. That kind of set me up for failure, I think. My main issue with this film is there is no story. I need there to be a story. Part of that is personal preference. There's people who are more interested in the story, people who are more interested in the characters. I'm a story girl. I need a beginning, middle, and end. I need a journey. So part of this is a preference thing, even though I personally think it's bare minimum that a movie have a story. If there's no story, then the characters should be the focus of the film. But here the characters aren't particularly complex or interesting either. Zone of Interest is basically a day in the home life of a Nazi, so they don't really do much, and most of the film is from their perspective, which is an interesting concept in theory, but it gets old in one note very quickly. There's no character development, it's not really saying anything new. Nazis were evil and callous about the atrocities that they were committing on a daily basis. I feel like we all know that already. Like, we get it. If you're not going to have a story and you're not going to have interesting, complex characters and relationships, there is absolutely no reason for the movie to be 1 hour and 45 minutes long. I don't hate this movie as much as it really sounds like I do, I just think it's way overhyped. There are quite a few things that are redeeming about this movie, but what I've landed on is I just think this would have been way better as a short film. That way it can still do the things it does best without having the time bloat of a non-existent story and character development. There's also some things that verge on too pretentious for me, like opening on a black screen for 2 minutes, the random red screens, the scenes in negative. I'm not even gonna lie, I obviously just don't understand that at all. I liked the performances by Sandra Huller and Christian Friedel. They were so cold and strict, which felt so real, and it made it very easy to dislike them. I loved the visual juxtaposition of this beautiful garden right on the other side of a concentration camp wall. I also really like the way the film looks, the cinematography, the colors, the costumes and hair, and that's why I think it would be better as a short film. They could show all of that off in 20-30 minutes. Then I watched the latest M. Night Shyamalan film, Knock at the Cabin. This one was completely fine. There wasn't anything too special about it. The story and structure is somewhat interesting, but again isn't too shocking. I gotta support my Broadway people, so Jonathan Groff, I love to see it. I also love that Rupert Grint has been working with M. Night lately. I hope it keeps happening. Make another movie together and it'll be 3 and it'll be a trend. His accent was peeking through a little bit, but I can look past that for him. Same with Ben Aldridge too, but that's fine. The standout for me was Dave Bautista though. I loved his performance in this so much. Someone cast him in that rom-com he wants to be in. Immediately, please. I think ultimately though, this movie was so middle of the road for me, and that's not really what I want in an M. Night Shyamalan movie. Like, where's the classic M. Night flavor? There was no flavor. Maybe that was on purpose since I think M. Night can be polarizing. You either love him or hate him. This film didn't really feel like it was from him. It could have been from any other nameless director out there. I had to watch the new Mean Girls, of course. I think most people are tired of the reboot, remake trend that's been taking over the past few years. This movie just takes it to the next level, though. It's uncomfortable for me how much of a carbon copy this is. There's so many iconic lines that it just feels so weird when a majority of the script is lifted from the original, but without the authenticity and magic that goes into the making of an accidental classic. It's just impossible to replicate. It feels so try-hard, lazy, and phoned in. The majority of the comedy just falls flat because, again, it's all lines that we've heard before. Some of the new attempted comedy bits took a more campy approach and also fell flat. The tone is so off. Most of the film has this TikTok Gen Z vibe, but then it tries to add in these campy moments that don't fit at all and just end up being cringy. I'm not even a big fan of the stage production. The music is mid, verging on bad, in my opinion. But this movie takes those songs and completely butchers them, specifically with the musical arrangements. I liked what they did with Someone Gets Hurt and Sexy, both with the song itself and the musical numbers. Some songs like I'd Rather Be Me are on the same level as the original. But as everyone else has already said, what the hell did they do to Stupid with Love? I don't know who said, okay, yeah, let's go with that. As far as the performances go, there were a lot of hits, a lot of misses. This is a mini review, so I'll just touch on a few. And Gowrie Rice was miscast. I'm sorry, girl. I've liked her in other roles, but this was just not her moment. Now again, I'm going to shout out my Broadway people. I love that they cast Renee Rapp, someone who played Regina on Broadway. She's super talented, I love her, but she doesn't quite reach the same highs as Rachel McAdams' Regina does. But she was still great, don't get me wrong. And of course, Jaquel Spivey as Damien was great. And then there's Ali'i Carvalho. I don't think she's technically a Broadway girly, but she's definitely Broadway adjacent, so I'm still going to include her here. She was great also. But ultimately, it's still Mean Girls. The base material is just so good that I can't help but love it in certain moments. And it has some cute moments, like I really like the scene at the dance and the cheesy message of I See Stars. The last film I watched in January was Society of the Snow, which is a new movie on Netflix based on the true story of this plane crash in the 70s and how the passengers survived. I think I mostly just loved the story, seeing how these people dealt with this impossible situation that kept getting worse and worse, and how they survived it all. Did it need to be 2.5 hours long? Probably not. One weakness for me here is definitely the characters. The film takes an interesting approach where it doesn't really follow a main character or even a small group of main characters. Usually a film like this will follow a small group and show their backstories so we get to know them a little better, have more of an emotional attachment, and this film doesn't really do that, which is an original approach I guess, but also wasn't really my favorite. Despite not getting to know each character as individuals, we do get a good understanding of them as a group, and I thought it was really interesting to see them constantly try to bring normalcy to their lives in a really abnormal, terrible situation. The film is hard to watch at times, being forced to see some of the things that they had to resort to. The music by Michael Giacchino stood out to me, and the cinematography as well, especially scenes that had all these frantic, claustrophobic camera movements. So those were all the movies I watched in January. Let me know what you thought about any of these films. Let me know what you watched in January. Before I go, I wanted to mention some of my inspirations for starting these monthly recaps. I know these people didn't create the concept of monthly recaps, but I feel like there will inevitably be some similarities there, so I wanted to give some credit to some of my favorite movie reviewers, Karsten Runquist and Spooky Astronauts. I love their videos and their monthly recaps, so go check them out if you haven't already, if you're ever interested in seeing more movie reviews and discussions. That's it for today's video. I'll catch you in the next one.